everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of our research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructure for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU is also the parent company of Michigan Virtual School, a supplemental state-sponsored virtual school, Michigan LearnPort, an online professional development portal for K-12 educators and personnel, and MyBlend, a blended learning initiative providing K-12 schools with resources, products, and services to personalize learning options for their students and improve student achievement. Before we introduce today's presenters and the topic of their presentation, an important disclaimer for our research webinar series. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information, which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and/or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU, MVLRI, unless otherwise specified. So today's presenters, starting off with Mary Frances Rice, is a doctoral candidate in curriculum and teaching at the University of Kansas. Prior to starting her doctoral work, Mary taught English language arts, English as a second language, and reading support classes at the secondary level in Utah. Her current research focuses on professional identity development in teachers as they co-make curriculum with students in technologized settings. She has also completed a number of studies on text complexity in online learning course curriculum and is interested in teacher researcher work. Mary has been honored by Division H and the Narrative SIG of the American Educational Research Association and the Emerald Literary Network for her scholarship. She is the author of Adolescent Boys' Literate Identity in 2011 and the editor of Exploring Pedagogies for Diverse Learners Online as of 2015. Her third book on educator professional identities and digital learning spaces is slated for publication in 2018. Richard Allen Carter, Jr. is a doctoral student in the Department of Special Education at the University of Kansas. Prior to initiating his doctoral work, Richard worked with learners with disabilities in elementary school settings in Kansas and his home state of North Carolina. His current research focuses on the implementation of self-regulation practices for students with disabilities in both fully online and blended learning environments. He has also conducted work that looks at disability accommodation and IEP development and implementation in online schools. In addition, Richard assists with studies that examine a broad range of effects of online instruction for students with disabilities for the Center on Online Learning for Students with Disabilities, or COLSD. He is currently part of a research team that is implementing technology-enabled personalization for students with disabilities in public elementary schools. And so now I'm going to hand it over to both of them. Learning from Educators Who Support Students with Disabilities in Online Courses is the name of their study, and there you go.
All right, welcome everyone. So we're glad to see so many of you are on here today. So as Dr. Kennedy said, I'm Mary Frances Rice, and my colleague and co-author is Richard Allen Carter, Jr. We're going to be giving this webinar. So we have published actually a number of studies based on this work with teachers of students with disabilities who are working in online settings. And these online settings include fully online setting, part-time online courses, and then also blended learning environments. So we have interest there as well. And we've both been public school teachers for a number of years. We work for the Center on Online Learning and Students with Disabilities. And our recent technical paper out of that work that profiles a lot of the research our center is called Equity Matters, Digital and Online Equity for Students with Disabilities. So we encourage everyone to visit the center site and also check out that document. So which is slated as an annual publication. So right now we're working on gathering information for next year's version. In terms of coming to do this work with teachers in online learning settings, I have a trajectory of work at the Center on Online Learning Students with Disabilities. I've done a lot of teacher researcher work on my own, and also thinking about teacher identity and the concept of non-personhood in teacher education, and just the way in which coming into to the public space of teaching results in sort of a lot of identity shifts in teachers. And there's a lot of research that's been done on teachers in traditional settings and the ways in which their identities are positioned differently depending on the school landscape that they enter. But in online learning spaces, much less. And so I was really interested in coming in and looking at teacher work in online settings, and especially in laying over the work of disability along with that, because of the difficulty that traditional teachers have in trying to make decisions and work effectively with students with disabilities in their regular schools. And then Richard is going to talk for a minute about some of the work that he's been doing.
Yeah, and probably just a minute because of the wonderful introduction from Dr. Kennedy. Thank you. So I primarily work around self-regulation in blended learning environments, and this is traditionally with schools that are just taking up blended learning as an initiative. And historically, we have schools that reach out to us through the center, and then we have schools that we reach out to. And what we find most of the time is that the thing they really want the most assistance with and talk around is self-regulation. And so we've spent considerable time developing tools, developing strategies to support student regulation in these blended learning environments. And we continue that work. And that work will serve probably as my dissertation as well. So something I'm very, very, very interested in.
Yeah, so we've both been coming at our interest in working with teachers, and also in sort of conceptualizing their work around the difficulties that present themselves in an online learning environment. And in particular, we're concerned about students with disabilities because we work at this online center, but also because students with disabilities who qualify for them have these documents that we probably know are called IEPs, or Individualized Educational Plans. And those plans are statements of measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals designed to meet the child's needs, that result from the child's disability and enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, and meet each of the child's other educational needs that result from the child's disabilities. And historically, students with disabilities have been mostly isolated in school systems, and they were not receiving the kinds of services that they would need in order to access a general education curriculum. And so then when legislation and other kinds of policies started to be enacted to enable their participation in schools among their peers, then those laws were originally developed to get those students with disabilities into the school. And when you're going to go and be in a traditional school with a traditional teacher, and then you have, as it says, meet each of the child's other educational needs resulting from the disability, then there's all these ways in which as soon as the student's in one place and as soon as they're then all of these adults can come around and meet whatever educational needs they have. But when you take the child and you move their coursework online, then it was of critical concern to us what happens to those students with disabilities in terms of not just sort of making the compliance piece work in terms of the individualized educational plan, but also in terms of what kinds of instructional accommodations are they receiving, and how are teachers learning to work with them effectively and assess them, and all of these things that, as former school teachers ourselves, we wondered those things about, well, when the child travels online, or when there's a migration online, what happens? So we have what we knew, which was about special education teacher preparation, and there's lots of studies that suggest that special education teachers are much less prepared than other teachers to go in and work with students. And this is because of the perpetual shortage of special education teachers that is usually the case in most states and in most districts, and the high attrition rate that they have. So they're always replacing these special education teachers with other teachers, and that causes states to come up with plans and programs for getting special education teachers into classes really quickly, but there's a lot to know about disability. And so consequently, generally speaking, special education teachers have weak understandings of students' needs, especially in terms of the IEP, and that's in traditional settings. And at the same time, then, online learning is enjoying this incredible growth. So it's becoming an incredibly popular way. There are lots of lots of states that require online coursework in order for graduation. Michigan is one of those. Florida is one of those, and other states are following suit. So some states have had, several 100% growth increases in the past few years. And at any given moment, even right now, as we're doing this webinar, there are millions of kids online doing online coursework. And so then that posed new challenges in terms of addressing that IEP. So it was developed in a traditional school setting. And even though the philosophy and behind the IEP was conceptualized a long time before online learning was even an option, and then thinking about how to really take care of those students. So, and that brought us what we knew brought us what we wanted to know, which was what, if any, accommodations are students with disabilities receiving in particular online settings, and how do they describe their roles in providing those accommodations, and then what's the quality and quantity of the interactions among the educators and other stakeholders at various levels in online schools. And so, these are the research questions that we work off of in the several studies that we've conducted. So, and Richard is actually going to talk about how we learned what we wanted to know. He's going to talk a little bit about our methodology.
So you can see this very nice graphic here. So we started identifying individuals at online schools. We talk internally about this next sentence here about 6 were male and 20 were female, and that we talk around how individuals are, especially in leadership roles, are coming from like a traditional school setting which in all of our studies pretty much rings true, and we have more conversations about that. We continue to have conversations. To do this, we developed interview and semi-structured interviews to just go through. Mary did some, I did some, and then we would meet back together and discuss. And then we also looked at IEP documentation, and then communication log, and of course achievement data for students in several online schools.
Yeah, so those secondary forms of data, including the IEP documentation specifically, was we were able to find out what accommodations the students were receiving, what their primary disability was, and their secondary disability. We also had information about which classes they took and which subjects they were in and whether or not they passed those classes. And we also had pacing information, so we knew how long it took for them to complete the course. So in terms of the employee communication logs, those are a really interesting set of data because they focused on whenever an online teacher had to make a phone call or communicate in any way with either an employee or a student or a parent, then they were obliged to log it some way. And sometimes the teachers had to directly log it, and sometimes there was technology in place where that was taken care of without them having to go in and do anything extra. And so, and we had achievement data for the students, both with and without disabilities, in several of these online schools. And in looking at the chart, then this, in terms of the stakeholders, or in terms of the people we looked at the top, are the regional directors of online schools. And not every online school has a regional director, but that was a possibility. Then there were also special education administrators. There were multi-school directors. There were other non-special education administrators. And then also general education teachers, special education teachers, the students, the parents, and related service providers. And for the studies that, the early studies that we did, we didn't focus very much on related service providers, but we have since gone in and done work on that, which could be the topic of another webinar. But we focus mainly on thinking about the general education teachers, the special education teachers, and the administrators that were working with them. So we were really interested in sort of the levels of leadership involved in meeting the needs of those students and what they thought they were doing and what they thought they should be doing in order to help these students be successful. So in terms of what we found for the teachers, then we looked at our data in terms of role construction, major concerns, and then the reconciliation strategies. And over and over again, we found that the teacher's primary responsibility, as they saw it, was to ensure the course completion. So it was very important to them to identify students who were not working in these online environments and to get them working. And usually the way that they got them working was that they would call the students directly, or text them, or call them and contact their parents and try to elicit some way to get the parent involved so that the student would begin working. A lot of the schools that we looked at had policies where if the student didn't turn in work after a certain amount of time, then they automatically received some kind of phone call from the school. And as we talked to the teachers, it was really important for us as we did these interviews not to disrupt their schedule because we knew they were working online. And but I asked the teachers who would talk to me for somewhere between 20 and 45, maybe even 60 minutes as I was calling them during the 10 to 12 weeks of these studies, how many students have called you while I've been talking to you? And sometimes in only 12 minutes, they'd get 30 to 40 phone calls, and they've got to call all of those people back. And in addition to taking care of the students that weren't making progress in the course and planning the mini lessons that they were going to provide, usually synchronously, so they let everybody know, hey, I'm going to do some kind of mini lesson about capitalization, or I'm going to do some kind of mini lesson about literary devices. And then students who were interested in having that extra instruction could just log on. So other schools did it where those things were already in place, and they were the instruction was already pre-recorded and maybe on YouTube or somewhere like that. and then the students would log on and see what was there. And there was some confusion sometimes as to whether or not that was the teacher. So you have a sort of a talking head, and then sometimes through the logs, it was evident that there was confusion about whether that person narrating video, the pre-recorded video, was a teacher, or if this other person that's calling me is the teacher. But ensuring course completion was really important. And then also they had to convey the curriculum, right? So they had to make sure that the students understood what the learning objectives were and that they would be able to meet those objectives. So much less time spent on this than ensuring course curriculum, and then finally building the relationships with the students. So, and again, this is about the teachers doing a lot of reaching out to students, and the students maybe call them back, and maybe they don't, but the teacher just has to keep on pushing. And they liked learning things about the students. So they like learning things about their learning and looking at that data, but they also like learning about the students' lives. So, and they would work really hard in order to make sure that the students had the things they needed. So when they found out the student didn't have access to some kind of calculation device, then there was a way for them to help the student get a hold of that. And when the students moved suddenly and stopped going through their online courses, that was just as troublesome to them as it was when I was teaching in a traditional school and students would suddenly move. And but building relationship is much harder, especially in those fully online environments, because unlike the chronotope, unlike the regular calendar of school, where we all start in August and then we go through and we have first term and then we have second term and we take a break during the winter, that the students are enrolling and unenrolling constantly. And some students come in and they can do all the course content in 3 to 4 weeks, and some students may be enrolled in the class for over a year. So, and their major concerns coming out of these roles then is the non-workers, is the curriculum inaccessibility and finding different resources in order to make that curriculum accessible, and then the relational breakdowns are really hard. So when the students would take the end of course test and they wouldn't do very well, and then parents would get upset about that, and there would be all kinds of phone calls and sometimes angry words exchanged between the parents and the teachers, or the students and the teachers, or the students and the parents. And in order to reconcile or deal with those major concerns, then like I said, there's this intense, heavy monitoring that goes on, and also the teachers working on how to provide strategic support to the students. So they would come up with PowerPoint presentations where they'd done really interesting annotation with the slides, and they would go out and find new products and services, usually those things that were free, in order to help the students, and then also offering social and emotional support. And what was interesting to us as we went through and looked at our data is how often that social and emotional support extended not only to students, but also to parents, right, who are struggling with the fact that they're trying to understand how to help their student who has a disability, but also they have other circumstances in their family, such as transience, so where they don't have a permanent home and suddenly they have to move somewhere. There was a particularly interesting story about this mother who got really angry and then wrote the teacher a note the next day asking for forgiveness. And she said, "We were just really upset because our cat died." And then she sort of narrated through the life of this dear pet. And the teachers also said that the parents, for whatever reason, they felt that these teachers, a lot of them had come from traditional settings. They felt like parents were maybe more amenable to telling them stuff because it seemed more private since it was over the internet. So you're not going to run into this person at the grocery store, and you're not going to see them all the time. It's just sort of a voice on the other end. So they felt in some ways that was an advantage. So in terms of the special education administrators that we talked to, they had a huge amount of role construction actually along the lines of advocating for online learning. So they want people to come in and do online learning and to have access to it. And these special education administrators were also a really important part of their mission then to think about how people perceive online learning, how families do, and whether or not they're prepared to be successful initially. So, and within that, then they also felt a lot of responsibility to mediate conflict that arose quite frequently over how the IEP was going to be implemented, and dealing with a lot of those, and then but also to enforce the policies of the school. And that was a real point of tension, because in some of the schools there are often policies about how students can work at their own pace and they can turn it in any time, all of which are major, very common types of accommodations on an IEP document. But then there were other policies, such as when the student goes to take the end of course test, then the technology is not set up to make sure that the student can take a break, which is another common accommodation for students with disabilities in online learning, is that they can take tests in small groups, they can have it read to them, and they can have breaks. But if you're especially in a fully online environment, then you take the end of course test, in order to prevent cheating, then they make it so that you have to do it all at the same time. And so having those teachers then, and those under the guide of the special education administrators, go through and make those plans in order to administrate that test in a way that will meet the needs of that student, was a major concern. There was tension often between school policies and then policies that were on IEP documents. And also that some of those tensions were exacerbated by the fact that in some schools, some online schools, they were involved in the creation of the IEP document initially, and some of the schools were not. And so then they were having to implement a document that they didn't create, and that had nothing, that was probably not incepted with the idea that students were going to do any of their work online. And so then there were always questions in those cases from those schools around who's the ultimate holder of the IEP. So who is the person, where's the buck stop in terms of making sure that the students have access to services, and whatever services needed to be made available to students, it was always much less of a problem when those services could be provided for free, and when they could be provided within the constraints of what was already available within the online environment. So when things started to cost money, or when you had to, like if a student has to have related service therapy where they've got to travel somewhere else, or that's outside the confines of the online school, generally speaking, and those are the places where the tension really emerged. So then among these special education administrators, there were a lot of misperceptions about online learning. So parents and students would come in thinking that it was going to be quick and easy, and actually doing online learning is really difficult. So we all tell ourselves, oh, I'm going to take that class online, and I'm going to sit in my pajamas and drink cocoa while I'm doing my online learning. And it's true, you can do that, but you have to plan to be in your bed, in your pajamas, with your cocoa, on your computer, with a good internet connection, in order for that lovely scenario to take place. And so there was a lot of, usually there was a transition period where students had to learn to do that. And in fact, schools began to take into account those transition periods, and they called them grace periods in a lot of schools, where the students could have 2 weeks to kind of work on the curriculum and get going, and then if they found out they didn't do as well, then there were ways to get them out of the online course and have them do something else. And then also thinking about the lack of information between the different school leaders and the other administrators and the teachers. So, because sometimes the IEP information was shared directly with the teachers, and sometimes they were only notified about sometimes they were only notified as to what the accommodations would be. And so those are the kinds of problems that special education administrators often have to field. And then of course the meshing of those multi-entity policies, especially when you have to collaborate with the traditional school or in the catchment area where the student came from, with the online school, with any related service providers, with any other kind of curriculum vendors. And the reconciliation strategies, of course, is to just educate people more about online learning and tell them as much as you can upfront about how this is going to require a lot of organization on your part, and that if you're going to take an online course, you have to have an internet connection, and you really have to have a device that is it's set up a little better than a cell phone, that's got a bigger screen on it, that you can read documents off of, that you can respond in meaningful ways to, and then to help people understand what those things are. And then also following up and fact-finding. So they did a lot of legwork on that. So there was a question and multiple people needed to be brought together. So like if students needed some of their answer choices eliminated for some of their assessments, then that requires the special education administrator, a general education teacher, a curriculum specialist, and usually at least one regular administrator in order to make those decisions. And whereas in a general education classroom, a lot of those things are just matters of teacher judgment, and they can just do them without having to go through without having to engage so much in collaboration. And we think that collaboration is good, but it was a place of difficulty for the teachers. The higher level administrators had concerns that you'd probably expect from them, in that it was really important to guarantee curricular fidelity. So the most important thing is that we've got this curriculum and we are presenting it and promoting it to the people that we want to come to our online school as being rigorous, and so we need to make sure that that curriculum is completely and totally implemented, as it exists right now. And then also they constructed rules around legal compliance and efficiency in the product delivery, because the higher up you went in the chain of authority, then the more online learning became a product. And that's sort of the way that it was talked about as a package or a bundle of products, and that the students and the parents were consumers of that product, and so it was important to make sure that they had a good experience with it. So their concerns were curricular modifications. They didn't want teachers to over-modify the curriculum. They would much rather prefer that the curriculum that existed was reformatted, or even you could give it in smaller pieces. But they wanted the students to use the same text, to be working on the same sets of objectives, and be going through, not necessarily at the same time, but that if everybody's going to do literary devices at the beginning of the course, and that they're going to talk about argument writing at the end of the course and not the flip. So you could do it whenever you wanted, but the tasks needed to be done in a particular order. So, and then also they weren't always in good relationships with the related services providers. when they had to. They, especially because a lot of them had contracted out related service providers such as speech therapists and occupational therapists, and they didn't really have good relationships with them. And then the last kind of important major concern we thought was the fitness of certain students for online learning, and especially as we talked to administrators, there was this sense of online learning is for everyone except for who it isn't. And the problem was for us is the who it isn't was students with disability. So and students who struggle, and that was difficult for us to reconcile in light of the fact that often online learning is spoken of, very optimistically in research literature among, as a way to sort of close gaps and to credit recover and to give students the opportunity, to avoid stereotype threat, right? Because they're working online and so their teachers don't know anything about their racial and ethnic background. And so it's this really egalitarian process for us. But there were a lot of administrators that we talked to who were especially adamant that students didn't have certain kinds of skills, especially in terms of self-regulation, so the ability to monitor their own work and get on the computer at the right time, at a time that was where they could work positively, or who had frequent emotional breakdowns, that those were students who were less fit for online learning. And in order to reconcile or deal with those development processes, to reconcile their concerns, then there was a lot of strategic hiring going on, and also a lot of professional development. And there was some debate among those higher level administrators as to whether it was more important to hire teachers who already had teaching experience or those who didn't. So some really wanted to hire special education teachers who had taught in a traditional environment because they thought that they came with a better grounding of the law and that they were better at responding to student needs. And then for online learning, they had to pick up the technology and they had to learn how to deal with students asynchronously and some of those kinds of things. While other administrators said, we actually prefer brand new teachers because this is a paradigm shift, and we found it really difficult to negotiate the paradigm shift. So then that's what the administrators were saying to us. So in terms of implications, so work with special education students in online learning is very time consuming because of efforts to keep them working mostly. And so one of the things that's really important as we thought through this, and this was true regardless of the kind of school. So some of these students from the schools that we were looking at did synchronous instruction. Some of them did asynchronous instruction. There was ones that were 100% self-paced. There was ones where schools where students were required to go in and at certain times and do certain parts of it synchronously. But the question for us is, what can educators do then to streamline these efforts so more time can be spent instructing? Because that seemed really critical, that the special education students weren't getting curriculum and content instruction. Instead, they were mostly being helped to learn how to move through the course. So, which is important, but it's not the kind of access to curriculum that was originally important in disability legislation. So, in terms of research, online educators are sort of moving through this pipeline from teacher to administrator, and they're doing so relying mostly on traditional narratives of school to help them transition. And sometimes those traditional narratives of school are really positive, like, oh, I learned all this stuff in traditional education, and so I'm going to take that into online learning. And sometimes they had really negative experiences in trying to do special education in traditional school, and so they wanted to come to online learning because they wanted another experience. So, but the question for us is, how are online learning administrators prepared And then how should they be prepared is maybe even a more important question. And then finally, in terms of implications for policy, so some students with disabilities were deemed or talked about or spoken about as if they were unfit for online learning. And these students were often counseled out of online schools eventually. One of the work that we did in one of the schools where we looked at achievement data demonstrated that most of the students who didn't finish were students with disabilities. And when they are students with disabilities, then the only choice for them was to go back into the traditional school environment, which had to be heartbreaking for them, because part of the reason why they're coming to these online learning courses is because they've been, they had not been successful in traditional schools. And one of the things about special education students in general that's really important is that they've got strong narratives, they've got strong stories more so about not being successful than being successful. So if you're going to work with students with disabilities effectively, then one of the most important things is to cultivate opportunities for them to have successful experiences. So both in the micro, so in the day-to-day, and then also in the macro. And so then we questioned what policy supports are needed to retain more students in these online courses, and then also how can IEPs, this policy, live more profitably in the online spaces? Because right now there's a tension, and it's not a healthy tension. So schools mostly are going to be places where there are that are rife with different kinds of tension, and that tension needs to be healthy, instead of ones where ultimately students aren't served very well. And so that is sort of the core of the research that we have been working on, that we've been doing. I think we are ready for questions. So, and I will answer some, and Richard will answer some.
So feel free to use your mic if you'd like to.
Yeah, Dustin's typing something. So other people, Dustin asked the question, what student perspectives were you able to capture? And in other work at the Center on Online Learning and Students with Disabilities, there are research teams that have been looking at capturing student perspectives on online learning. And so if you go to our site, then there's research there. In the work that we were doing that was focused mainly on teachers' work, then we weren't interviewing them about their perspectives, but the student data that we have is about their interaction with their teachers, and about the achievement that they were able to make and the progress they were able to make during the course. So the work that other people have done from our center on student perspectives has said that students mostly really like their online courses, honestly. They mostly like their online courses. They mostly enjoy their teachers. And but what's interesting is that both students and parents have told researchers from our center this in different studies, is that they can't tell what their disability services are. They don't know. And when we have asked in a set of forums that we did at the Center on Online Learning, we asked administrators and school directors to talk to us about that. And they tended to view that as positive, like as a measure of inclusion. Oh, the students aren't really sure who has an IEP and who doesn't, and we're able to meet those needs without having to bring attention to that. But in the IDEA legislation, it's in terms of participation, and also those provisions around parent advocacy, we couldn't see how the transparency required in the law was being met when neither students nor parents know what the accommodations are that the students are receiving in their online school. So that's some thoughts about student perspectives. Oh, yes, and Richard actually is finding some of the vendor topics from those papers. So, but we did these forums over the course of a year, and we talked to state directors of education about online learning of students with disabilities. We talked to school directors from across the country, and then we talked to vendors. So we talked to the people who are making this curriculum, and who sometimes the vendor makes the curriculum and runs the school, and so that's really important. And sometimes that's not true. So so those are good papers to go and look at. Okay. Dr. Kennedy said that she asked, what types of studies do you feel will be good spin-offs for the study and other research at the center? And one of the studies that we took up sort of in the wake of this work was about related service providers and finding out what related services looked like when they appeared online, because now you can do speech therapy online and occupational therapy and even physical therapy online, and what those looked like, especially when those services were being attended to under the auspices of a virtual school. And so that's one study that we looked at afterward. We also have been interested in higher education and especially special education teacher educators, and thinking about what aspects of online learning are they including in their coursework, and then what kinds of pressures do they have in the work that they're doing to talk about or not talk about online learning as an option for students. And then some other work that we're doing right now is focusing more on figuring out more about best practices in terms of special ed teaching. So there is some work that has been done, some very good work that's been done on teaching in online learning environments and what kinds of particular skills teachers need in order to be successful. And out of that came the INACOL teacher quality standards. But we're trying to gather more information about what kinds of practices may be important that are unique in particular to special education teachers. So I saw another question up higher about, do you remember?
To what extent could instructors accommodate learning?
Okay. All right, Richard's going to take that question.
Hi, Dustin, great question. So when we talk to these individuals, and what our research has found is that when we think of accommodating the online learning environment, we're still thinking around accommodations around testing, and so and rightfully so. So, but we're trying to figure out what it actually means to accommodate, because a teacher immediately is going to say, well, we do all that because the system does things like this. The system can highlight, the system can read back to you, the system can, the computer can do many of the things that traditionally would have to be written into an IEP. You can have, for instance, separate settings to take a test. Well, there's no more separate setting than in your bedroom. So these are things that we're still trying to figure out. And what's interesting is that when we started to talk more and more with educators around the accommodations, they started moving into modifications, thinking, okay, so now I can do a couple of things. I can take I can take a test and I can break it down into one slide, which again is an accommodation, but that's what they were doing, and they were delivering that trying to deliver that to several people at one time. So I still think we need to figure out what exactly, almost, I hate to say it, but almost a legal definition of what an accommodation is in an online learning environment. And then once that's aside, because right now a number of individuals are just assuming that this is occurring because the student has access to it. And I'll give one little anecdote from this, and I'll pass it on. So a student needs a screen reader to participate in their education. As one teacher was telling us, and the teacher tells us that there's a free one online, but the teacher really thinks that the student needs Dragon Speak, which they can't pay for. They don't have the resources to pay for. So, so you're moving to, and so Dustin's making some really good points in here. So you're moving to, we still have to just kind of figure these things out, and we have to talk more around them. What are these terms actually mean in an online environment versus a brick and mortar?
Yes, because I think it's really important to consider the ways in which schools oriented around online learning as inherently accommodating in some ways. So a lot of them thought because the students can work at their own pace, then that takes care of whatever that accommodation is on the IEP. But we know from working with students with disabilities that you can offer students lots and lots of time, but if you don't put in other supports to make sure that they are working along the way, then it doesn't matter if you give them all the time in the world. So, and also sort of the idea that students, not just students with disabilities, but young people like working with technology. They like learning over the internet. They like being able to look at their content and to look at a lesson or watch a math lesson, for instance, and go back and watch it 25 times, and they don't have to ask the teacher to repeat themselves. They can just click on that lesson and, look over those notes or download that PowerPoint presentation. And, and young people really appreciate those kinds of opportunities to use technology effectively, and so then there's the sense that their interest in technology is going to carry all of their engagement, and it doesn't. So, and that's really a lot of stuff about Richard's work, where in self-regulation is that they're interested in doing things with technology, but that technology inherently doesn't sustain all of the engagement as well. So, and Dustin said something else. Let's see. Look, so it was about section 508, maybe. As you discussed online learning with teachers and administrators, was there an awareness of 508 compliance? Oh, actually there was, but the only people who really talked about it were the special education administrators. The higher level administrators didn't necessarily talk about section 508 at all, and the teachers were not aware of that too. The first thing out of most of the special education administrators, after they told us about how they came to their current position, was them saying, "Oh, and we're Section 508 compliant." That was really important, for them to say, because when you go through and when you interview people, then they are. Initially, then they're worried that you're going in and trying to determine whether or not their school is a good school or not, and we weren't doing that at all. So, yes, and that's actually a really important point about, it says the virtual learning tools operate in Flash and a screen reader can't read. So there was also a number of issues with a lot of the programs and a lot of the curriculum runs on JavaScript. And JavaScript isn't readable by lots of different kinds of computers, especially the smaller ones. And, like the Chromebooks, for instance. And so then having those be the computers that can be checked out to students or that students can use when they don't run really critical software is a huge compliance issue. So that we saw. Oh, then Ray says, yeah, but are they really 508 compliant? And in other work that we've done at the center, we've developed this tool called a VPAT table, and it was sort of a way, we were interested in aggregating exactly what kinds of compliance pieces were available in lots of online learning tools. And mostly we found that the 508 compliance is fairly spotty. It's not, but there was an interest in being 508 compliant and that they were working towards those kinds of things, but that, like I said, as soon as, or like Dustin pointed out, yeah, but if you're going to run something on Flash, a screen reader won't work for that. And and not all the websites could be very easily read, and I talked about this problem with Java. So there's a number of barriers to 508 compliance that are the responsibility is on the school, but it's also just one of those problems with the proliferation of technology. As it grows and as we get more tools, then you're always out of date, and keeping up with the 508 compliance was a struggle for those schools. So, all right, we have about 4 minutes left.
Any other questions for Mary and Richard?
Ray just wrote, talking about the 508 rewrite will make it even more interesting for vendors. We agree. So anytime you have those pieces that come in that are new, then it's going to make the vendors more interested in what they're gonna have to do. And honestly, in our vendor forums where we actually brought together those forum papers where we brought together the major vendors of online learning curriculum, there's definitely a sense from them that in order to be 508 compliant and also to make their curriculum more accessible in other ways to students with disabilities, that that's cost prohibitive for them, and that they are going to need lots of money in order to do it, and they are expecting that somehow grants or loans or whatever will be made available through the federal government for them to do that. So they're aware of it, and they sort of conceptualize how it might be done, but they're also saying, hey, this is expensive, and if it's important to the government, then they should fund it. And so that's an interesting sort of policy edge. Because if you're, one of the things about vendors in terms of curriculum creation is if you go back and think about just textbook companies in general, then the general premise of a textbook company in terms of when they're developing a text is that they want to make it appeal to as many people as possible so that they don't have to print a bunch of versions. And with online learning curriculum, then the idea was or the vision in our head, the ideal is that you could really easily create a lot of different versions of curriculum that would benefit a lot of different students. But in reality, the vendors are still mostly operating off the paradigm that we want to make this set of curriculum, and we want to make it a sequence of lessons that can appeal to the broadest range of consumers or of students and users as possible. And because students with disabilities are generally speaking, such a small percentage of our school student population, so it's, we're running 10 to 13% nationwide generally, and then in online learning there are even less of them. particularly when they, in some schools. So Michigan, that might not be the case, but in a lot of online schools, the special education students make up a really small percentage of those online course takers. Then they're not going to make the curriculum in a way that appeals to them. So that's a huge problem too. And the only way then, historically that's been dealt with, because of their status, as being so few of them, is, for the government to step in and say, no, you have to do this. And then, like I said, the vendors come back and say, okay, then you have to pay for it.
Thank you so much again for this extremely important topic, Mary and Richard. We hope that you will continue to be here and representing COLSD and all the amazing work you guys are doing at the center. Again, I'm going to repeat, Mary, what you put into the chat box. If you are interested in collaborating with the center on online learning students with disabilities, please email them at info@centerononlinelearning.org. And Mary's email is mary.rice@ku.edu. Richard's is richard.carter@ku.edu. And we will be posting the recording for this webinar. Just two quick updates in terms of ways that you can share your work here at MVLRI. We have a wonderful podcast, which our Justin Bruno heads up, and that's Virtual Viewpoints. And then also our guest blogger program. So we welcome any content you would like to share, any of the work that you're doing research-wise. We do also have an upcoming webinar on March 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern. It's on professional experiences of online teachers in Wisconsin, results from a survey about training and challenges. And that is going to be presented by the REL Midwest. And of course, anytime you guys want to reach out to us, you can use a number of different ways, as you can see. We greatly appreciate, again, Mary and Richard from COLSD being our special guests today and sharing the amazing work that you're doing. So anybody has any questions, we'll stick around here, but otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.